Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprung up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." Then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear."
Well, as I said at the start, today we start this new short series that we're going to be looking at over the summer holidays over January. And whilst it is a series that we're working through, every sermon will be really its own thing. So it doesn't matter if you're away for a week and miss one, because we're not working our way through a book where each week builds off the last sermon. Instead, this will just be looking at a handful of short passages disconnected from each other, that each week we'll go through one of these many parables that Jesus taught in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, you notice I didn't mention John. There are no parables actually recorded in the Gospel of John. Instead, all the parables that we have, they come from the first three Gospels. And whilst there are a lot of them in those three books, as I said, we're only going to be looking at 5 well-known ones that we're probably all very familiar with. But it's always good to think about them again and see what it is that we can be learning from them, or just be reminded about things that we may have forgotten. These parables are really good for us to be thinking about, as it's how we learn most of what Jesus taught, as this is one of his main forms of teaching. Now, before we can start the series and start going through these parables, it's important to first ask the question, what is a parable? We know that Jesus used them, but we need to understand how they work and what the point of them is, or we might unfortunately misunderstand what is that Jesus actually teaching through them. And basically, a parable is just a very, very short story that has what is a deeper meaning behind it. So, like many kids' books or cartoons, they use characters and a short story looking at a situation or an event that is used to teach kids about life. It's used to teach them a moral that they can then compare to real life events. So it's really just an example or an analogy to say that this is like this. Sort of like Forrest Gump's famous life is like a box of chocolates. He's not saying that life is literally a box of chocolates, but if you can picture what this is like, if you can picture a box of chocolates, then you can see how this other thing is similar, how life can actually be like that. You can see how just like how you cannot know what chocolate you're going to get inside the package until you open it, then you can also not know how life is going to turn out, as it's also full of surprises that you can't expect. You know, it's something that you can't really predict. And this method of comparing one thing to another, this didn't start with kids' cartoons. It didn't start with Forrest Gump, but it's actually a very old form of teaching to help people understand something deeper about a subject by use of comparisons. And that is exactly what Jesus does. He uses imagery to teach about heaven. He says that if you want to know how God works, if you want to know what heaven is like, well, here's a short little story that you can understand. Here's a story about family or farming or being a servant. And if you can picture that from your own life experience, then you can now also imagine what heaven or God's ways are like as well. So Jesus uses these little stories not as a literal teaching. He's not teaching about farming or the issues of crime or anything like that. But he uses these little things to say, picture this, and then you will also know what heaven is like as well. You'll know what God expects of you in how to live your life. But because they are stories, we do need to interpret them so that we do get the deeper meaning. We need to look at what each part means, what the situation is, who each character in the parables represent, and then by these comparisons, we can come to better understand God and how to live for Him in this world. So this means we're not to read them literally, but to get deeper truth that the parable is conveying. We're trying to understand the message behind it. So having now looked at what a parable is and how we are to read these things, the first one we're going to be looking at today comes from, as you know, Mark 4, verses 1 to 9, the parable of the sower, as it's known. And this is a special one for a couple of reasons. There's a reason why we do start with this one, because unlike the others, this one does give the answer. It tells us what the deeper meaning is all about. It explains itself. Our other parables don't do that. Jesus tells a little story, and then we need to figure it out. We, the listener, the reader, have to figure it out. We need to work out the comparison that he is making. And this working it out and how we go about it comes from our ability to know God's ways. So what that means is other people will hear the same parable. They'll hear exactly what Jesus says, and they'll dismiss it as just a silly story about farming. They won't search for the deeper meaning because they're closed off to God. So they don't want to learn. So they don't try to understand it. And that is one of the things we see Jesus say here. Whilst we only read out verses 1 to 9 a moment ago, we'll actually be looking at 1 to 20. And final 11 verses tells us about the purpose of parables as well as the answer to this one. But we didn't read it out because we don't want to get the answer just yet. We'll look at it in a moment, but we first want to look at the parable, have a think about it, and then we'll actually go for the answer that Jesus gives us. But the point of starting with this one is that unlike the others, this one does give the interpretation. Jesus will go through his own parable and say, this character means this event means this, so we now know what it's about. We don't actually have to guess. So there's the first reason why this one is very important and why we start with this one today for our series. It gives us a key to understanding how parables work. It shows us the correct way to interpret them. Now, the second reason for looking at this one, it's actually, in this case, a more personal reason. And a more personal reason for me, and maybe when I tell you what it is, maybe it's something that you can relate to as well. Because part of Jesus explaining this particular parable and how to read it, this also tells us why people don't try to understand it. The parable itself tells us why people can't understand the other parables and why they don't even try to, because this one will explain why people are closed off to everything Jesus had to say. As I said a moment ago, people will dismiss it. It's just a silly little story, and this one actually tells us why they'll dismiss these parables as just silly little stories. So when I first started going to church, I was 17, and I was in year 11. And I got invited up to youth, and I started going to church, but many of us had been going for much longer than me. They'd been going maybe their entire life. Their family had been going up to church. But over the next couple of years, a lot changed in that group of kids that I was a part of. People had been going to church for years, just stopped. They got to their HSC or they got their first year out of school, and they just stopped church altogether. And also, whilst I started coming up near the end of school, so halfway through year 11, I was not the last person to start going. Other people were invited and they started coming along after me. They started coming along near the end of year 11 and even during year 12. And as they started coming after me, I saw them start, take interest, hang around for a few months, and then just stop altogether. Or in some cases, saw people come for what was maybe just a week or two and then never come back. And this raised the question, well, why? I didn't come from a Christian family. Started coming in my late teens. I heard the gospel and I believed it and stayed around with no desire to ever leave. I wanted to stay at church. So why did these other people come and go? Why did some lose interest after just a few months? Why did others reject the gospel after hearing it the first time? They came 1 week, heard it, never wanted to come back. And why did those who were there before me, people who even invited me up and have been going for years, why did some of them stop coming altogether? What is it that causes people to hear the need for Jesus, to hear the good news of salvation, and the amazing opportunity to know their Creator, and yet either dismiss it immediately or after a short period of time? Sometimes after just weeks, sometimes after years of being at church, to lose interest and then just go back to the world that they've been brought out of. And as a young Christian who had only been there for a couple of years, that was my questions, as this was what I was observing happening and wondering what was going on. And it was first year out of school, and it was at our annual church camp. And it was being held at the Katoomba, not one of the conventions, but it was being held up near that site. And the talks that weekend answered that question, right? I found out the reason. Okay, why did some people not stay around? Why did some people stay for a long time and then disappear? And they answered those questions with this parable. Jesus already dealt with and warned about this very issue in this parable. And there'll be different responses to the gospel. And this will mean that while some respond to what Jesus says, others will forget or they'll reject it. And that is not to do with the gospel. It's not the gospel it's the problem. It's to do with their heart. They hear the same gospel message, but they respond in different ways because they've either closed themselves off from God or they've allowed the world to pull them back into sin. So for me personally, this one really helped me as a young Christian to understand what was going on around me. Why were people hearing the same message as myself, many of them even before I did, and yet somehow rejected the gospel in a way that didn't make much sense? And if you've ever had a similar experience, if you ever asked those same questions, then hopefully looking at this morning will help answer that for you as well. As we go through this, it might go, yeah, I can actually see that. I could even put a name to it and think of people who perhaps are represented by different parts of this parable here. So let's have a look at it now. I've explained what the parables are. I've explained why we're starting with this one. Let's actually get into this parable. So in verse 1, we see the passage starts with it saying that Jesus had a crowd around him, right? So it says here, again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that they got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake whilst all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. So heaps of people want to hear what Jesus has to say. So this is very early in his ministry, and he's been going around the northern regions up of Galilee. So this has been the Sea of Galilee, and it goes under several names in the Bible. The Lake of Gennesaret is one of them. And Jesus has gone into a boat as there are so many people want to hear from him that he actually couldn't stand on the land anymore. He had to go out on the lake. Now, keep that fact in mind as we go through this parable, because as we know later on in the Gospels, many of these same people will no longer be following him, and this parable actually explains why. They all wanted to hear from him early on, but in the coming months, most of them will have deserted him, and they will reject everything that he had to say. They'll ignore all those other parables, including this one. So the passage goes on, and it says, he taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, and then we see the start of this parable. a story that has 4 parts to it. They're really important to understanding how we come to God and how we respond to the gospel message. Why it is that many of these same people who crowded Jesus off the shore, they were so desperate to hear from him, why they would soon walk away from him not long after this very event. So looking at the parable itself now, the actual story, Jesus starts by saying, listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. So there's a story part to this. Jesus is going to use the imagery of a farmer sowing seed, planting seed, which is something that the people he's talking to would all be able to relate to, right? They would all get what this sowing is all about. So they would be able to then get the comparison that he's about to make. And then we see the first of 4 things that happen to the seed. So in verse 4 it says, as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path and the birds came up and ate it. So in the first part, we see the seed is spread, but it's useless, right? It falls on the path, so it doesn't get a chance to grow, and then the birds come and eat it. So it does nothing, right? It's a waste. But then in verse 5, we get what is the next part, right? The next seed. So it says here, some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. So with this seed, unlike the ones that get eaten straight away, some did last for a bit, right? They did grow for a moment. But because they're on shallow bits of soil between rocks, they've got no depth, right? No roots, so they don't last. So they're okay for a bit, as long as it's not too hot and there's a bit of rain. But a few days of no water or a few hot days, and they dry up and die. But then we get to the next one, and this one is different. This one has both what you'd probably say is a positive and a negative outcome, as this seed does grow, but not very well, right? There are other issues going on. So in verse 7, it says this. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. So these ones did grow, but because they're in the weeds, they got choked. They didn't fully grow. So they haven't died like the first 2. They have become a plant, but they're unproductive. They've been planted for a purpose, for a crop, for a harvest, but they've failed to do much more than simply exist. Right? They're getting choked out by the other plants, so they're of no use. But then finally, after having a seed that didn't even start, right, gets eaten by the birds, another that started but it died very quickly, and another that became unproductive, we then get the 4th and last one, and we get a positive outcome. So verse 8 says this. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. And these ones worked, right? They grew to being useful as they became large plants that produced a crop. But even more than that, we see that they multiplied. They got more seed and grew more plants. So unlike the first 3, this one does what it is supposed to do, right? It reaches its potential and it is actually useful. So there is the parable. This is what Jesus told the people by using a story about farming that they could relate to. But the question for us now is, what does it all mean for Christians? Right? What is the message of this parable? As said at the start, parable is simply a story that means more than it appears. It uses imagery to teach about heaven. So we know this isn't about farming or seeds, but they're being used to teach something about God. So we need to interpret what each part means. Well, which means in this case, what is a seed? What is a farmer? What are each of the plants? What do they all mean and teach us? But as also said at the start, the reason why we're starting with this one is because the interpretation is easy. And it's easy because Jesus gives the answer. The next part of this chapter is Jesus walking the disciples through each one of the seeds and explaining what it all means. So let me read on, and we'll now look at what Jesus says each part means and what that shows about how we respond to the gospel message. So Jesus says this in verse 14. It says, the farmer sows the word. So it's saying God is spreading the gospel, the good news. That's the word. This is what is being taken out to the world. So that is what is being spread around. In fact, in the other records of this parable, the one that we have in Matthew and the one that we have in Luke, we see this made very clearly. So if we go to Matthew 13:9, it simply says, the message of the kingdom of God. Whereas if we look at Luke 8:11, it says, the seed is the word of God. So this is a gospel message that comes from God going out to the world. Not literal seed being planted to grow crops, but God's message of how we are saved, making disciples of Jesus. Then it says how people will respond to this word. The word goes out, but it then explains how people respond, how people will accept or not accept the gospel message once it's been given to them. So verse 15 now explains what that first seed is like in a Christian context. It says, some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. So in the parable, Jesus was saying, you throw literal seed on the path and it won't grow. Right? There's no soil and the birds will simply come and take it. But now he says, this is like the gospel where people are told the good news, but before they grow, before it can impact them, like a bird, Satan swoops in and takes that word away. So they never come to God. They never become Christians as they don't take the message to heart. So then a person who comes to church or youth group or sees a gospel presentation on TV or on social media, and they simply don't care. Right? Their heart is hardened to the message because they've already given their heart to the devil. They're not going to listen to the good news. So even though they've had a chance to hear it, they won't respond to it. It'll never take hold of them. Which was a lot like some of those kids that I saw up at church when I was young, coming up to church after when I started. They came for a week, maybe two, but they didn't stay. The gospel had no impact on them. So the same opportunity to hear the gospel, but because of their hardened heart, they just rejected the message. They had no interest in hearing it. So that's the first seed. People who are so closed off, the gospel has zero impact and they just totally reject it. So then after the first seed, Jesus explains what is the next one. What does the second seed look like when it comes to telling the people the message? So in verse 16, this is what we read. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So like the seed on the rocks that has little soil, so it can't have a deep root. That means that when the sun comes out, it dies. And likewise, there are people who hear the gospel, they like what they hear, it sounds good to them, a relationship with God, eternity in heaven, they like all this, they're not against it. But then when something bad happens, they then have a change of mind. They become like that first seed and they just reject God. They're not interested anymore. So this is like the people who come to church, not for 1 week, but for a time. They come, they like it, they get involved, but then when that comes at a cost, when it's not all positives, but being a Christian means sacrifice, they then give up, which is what Jesus is saying here. He says, when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, as in because of the fact they go to church, because they're Christians, it costs them something in their life. And then they quickly fall away. And that is something that we're seeing more and more of in our own society. Right? This is becoming very common in Australia today. Being a Christian in the 20th century Australia, that was actually pretty easy, right? Because you're in the majority. No one cared that you go to church, right? It was pretty normal, in fact, the earlier in the 20th century to go to church. That's just what most people did. But as we've seen recently, being a Christian now, 21st century, in certain parts of our society, talking about your faith publicly, that could come at a cost now, right? It could cost you your job. It could cost you everything. It could make life hard for you. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. People will like the gospel message whilst it's easy. But if they actually have to take up their cross and follow him, as we see said in other places in the New Testament, the cost of being a disciple, taking up your cross, well, then they give up. And they give up because they've got no depth. So for them, it's just easier to not make themselves a target than it is to stand strong in their faith. To stand strong and face the consequences of having a deep, committed faith. Which is something I saw a lot of in my first couple of years of going to church. You know, people who started coming to youth group, coming to church on Sunday even, really liked it. They seemed genuinely interested. But when they had to make changes in their life, when they had to consider the time that they had to give to church, when they had to think about decisions they had to make, who they dated, what they did on the weekend, well, that was often a cost that they didn't want to pay. Right? They were interested when it was easy, and just games at youth group on a weeknight. But when their faith had to shape their life, well, they showed they had no real faith at all. That it was too hard, so they walked away. But then after this warning of people having what is a fake faith, showing interest initially, but then very quickly dying out, like the seed in shallow soil. Well, after that one, we then get what is the third seed. And this one is a bit different because you could almost take it one of two ways. It could be talking about someone who is not a Christian, like seed 1 and 2, or it could be talking about someone who does accept Jesus, they receive the gospel, but they're very, very weak in their faith. Right? It doesn't really have a big impact on it. Because we've seen verse 18, Jesus explains the third type of response to the word. And he explains it in this way. So he says here, verse 18, like others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. So thinking of literal seed again, in this case, the plant grows. But because of the weeds around it, it never reaches full potential. They stop it from fully growing. So it doesn't not even start like seed 1. It's not like that. It does actually get going. Nor does it seem to die after a short time like seed 2. Instead, it seems to grow, but not fully develop. It gets held back. It grows, but not fully. So this could be like a person hearing the gospel, they accept it, they don't reject it or give up on it, but because of other things in their life, right? Because of school, because of study at uni, because of work, because of the friends that they spend time with, because of the family that they have, whatever it is that negatively affects their spiritual growth, they don't become more like Christ, right? They don't really grow. They don't get mind of Christ. They don't stop calling themselves Christians. They don't ever renounce the faith, but they get choked like the plant in the weeds. They don't become useful. Hence why it says, the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth and desires of other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. So it doesn't say that their faith dies. It doesn't say that the plant dies. But church attendance, Bible reading, being involved in church, by doing ministries and cutting sin out of their life, being serious in their faith, none of this really happens. And it doesn't happen because they're basically cold in their faith. They haven't rejected the gospel, but it's not really impacting their day-to-day life. However, whilst that is one way that you could read this, you can also read this as people just like seed too. But instead of losing faith after a few weeks or a few months or when trouble comes, they might last several years or even decades until they kind of just give up. So they had more root than the other type, but you still wouldn't call it saving faith. Not something that will actually change them into who they are. Because it does say they are unfruitful. And elsewhere, Jesus says, by their fruit, you will know who his people are. And as mentioned before, we're called to take up our cross and follow him. And if we won't take up our cross, then we aren't his true followers. That's part of the thing. Following Christ is a full life commitment. But the point is, however you read this, either as someone who is weak in their faith, just idling along, or someone with no faith just putting on more of a show than seed two. They lasted longer before they dried up and died. Whatever the case, the point is still clear. This is not the way Christians should be. We're told not to worry about the things of this world, not to store up wealth, and not to desire worldly things. This is still not right. And it's sadly something seen in a lot of churches, people coming along from time to time, but never really committing to the kingdom. Which again, something I saw a lot of as a young Christian. Kids who are very committed to church through most of their school years, but as HSC hit, or as they started uni, or went into the workforce, or got into serious relationships with someone who either had no faith or was just on the edges. These same people who seemed very committed, sadly, they got choked by the world. It was easy when they were 16 years old, but when real life hit, when real responsibilities hit, they found their commitment tested, and they slowly pulled away from the church, and they got distracted by other responsibilities. Which is why we then get to the last one. And when we get to this last one, we see what is a massive contrast to all that has come before it. Because this one is clearly showing the right response to the gospel. But when the word goes out, this is how we are to respond to it, and how we can clearly see without doubt who Jesus' true followers are by how they respond to it. So have a look at verse 20. Let's just have a look at this here. Others like seed sown on good soil hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop. Some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. So this is what happened when seed has good soil, has deep roots, and it's not choked by weeds, right? It simply grows. It becomes big, it grows fruit, and it drops other seeds. More plants grow up from it. And likewise, this is what happens when a Christian hears the gospel and they truly accept it. They see how wonderful it is. And when they see that, when they understand it, they drop everything and it changes their life, right? They now live for Jesus each day. And then they tell others the good news, right? They point others towards Jesus, who then come to know Jesus as well. So this is what the typical Christian should really look like. They make it a priority to attend church. They read the Bible regularly, and they're involved in the church, doing ministries, and making sure to cut sin out of their life. Right? The word changes them, and they become more like Christ. And they get out and they tell others about Jesus. They want everyone to know the good news and to grow the church even more. It has such an impact on them. Why wouldn't they go out and tell everyone they know the good news about Jesus? So the point of all this is to sum up this parable. It's to simply say that the gospel will go out. But as it goes out, people will respond to it differently. The word is the same, right? It's the same message, the same good news on offer. But depending on the person being told, the responses will be different, right? They're either going to ignore it and go about their lives, So they'll be like that first seed, the one on the path. It'll have no impact because their heart is hard to it. Or they'll accept it for a bit and then they'll forget it, like seed on rocks. There's no root, so they don't last in the faith. They walk away. Or they accept it, they grow a bit, but then they stop growing. Like the seed in the weeds, they never grow fruit. They never reach their potential. Or they could be like the last one. They hear it, they turn to Christ, they live for Him, and like seed on good soil, they grow to become full of fruit and they spread even more seed. And in all these cases, the seed's the same, but the result is very different depending on the ground it falls on. And likewise, the gospel is the same. It's the same message, but this explains why some people accept it and others don't. Why some will hear and believe and it will change their life, and on others it will have no impact or they'll give up after a time. Why some will hear the other parables and they'll try to understand it. They'll go, I want to know what Jesus is telling me. And why others will hear the same words and they'll reject them as just stupid stories. They'll go, that's a load of nonsense. It's about farmers. It's about whatever. I don't care about that. And in those situations, it all comes down to them. It comes down to their attitude, their heart. The issue is, are they open to the gospel or are their desires for the things of this world? And what Jesus is saying is, be number 4. Right? Be the seed on good soil. Live for Him. Be committed to reading the Bible and praying to Him. Right? Have that firm, deep root and cut off the weeds. Right? Don't let the world choke you. And hopefully you're doing it. Right? Making sure to read His word, praying to Him, going to church, living for Him each day. And if you're not, if you're going, well, yeah, I don't know if I really am reading His word and really focus on living for Christ. Well, this is the first day, right, of 2023. Make it a New Year's resolution. Say I'm going to be at church each week, if possible, if practical. I'm going to read through the entire Bible this year. Set a challenge for yourself. Say I'm going to stop watching that TV show. It has a bad influence on me. Or I'm going to make a list of people to invite to church, have a gospel conversation with, and do it. I'll speak to these people throughout this year. One of the things that the kids on this very camp were challenged with, they said, as we start this year, think of one person who you want that word to go to, that gospel message, and pray for them every week. Make that the focus of this year. Pray for them that they will hear that gospel message and they too will be like that 4th seed, that they'll grow and that they'll change and they'll come to live for Christ. But the point of all this is to make sure that if we've heard the word, if we've heard it, be the crop that multiplies, right? Don't let anything get between you and living for Jesus each day, and take every opportunity you've got to get out there and make sure that you're telling people that gospel message so they too have that opportunity to hear that word and to respond.